Okay, so how do you deal with a runaway project like this? My main method in the past has been to cut content, and this approach was based on my experience in film and animation and VFX. One good example from about 10 years ago, I made a short film called Cows Are Evil. It was really ambitious, as most of my projects tend to be. The short was broken into three parts. The cow escapes captivity, the cow gets revenge on its owner, and then the cow mutates into a Godzilla monster and destroys a city. And the total running length was supposed to be about 5 minutes. When you're making a movie, the longer the movie is, the more time you can expect to work on it. I mean, yeah, some parts they're going to be like trickier than others, but generally speaking, it sort of blends together, and there's a roughly linear relationship between production time and running time. So when I found myself working on this short film for a year, I decided enough was enough, and I opted to cut the last third of the story and just tie up loose ends as best I could. I bring up this example to kind of establish my attitude towards projects. You know, what matters is that I finished the thing and sent it out into the world. I'm not after perfection. I'm not even after my original vision. I'm really just after a finished product and getting as much as I can out of it. So when you're cutting, you do create some work for yourself as you remove pieces of a story. It's not quite an inverse of the relationship that you see when you're adding content. Especially with a complicated story. But I've also found that as you remove more and more and start eliminating entire plot threads instead of just connective tissue, the relationship starts to become linear again. So overall, this is a fine way to keep an ambitious project in check. Ideally, you want to plan well enough so that you don't have to cut stuff. But if you do have to cut stuff, it saves you a lot of work. Now, this approach is something I've kept in mind from the start with Frontier. So let's look at our interactions matrix with an eye to core versus ambient gameplay really quick. As you can see, very little of the game can be considered core. This is actually why I chose the term ambient gameplay to begin with, because most of these elements are in there to sort of evoke a feeling, not to accomplish a specific gameplay goal. In the same way that the ambience of a movie can sort of evoke a mood or a feeling. The open world gives you a feeling of many places to explore, just like the open scenery in a Western. And something like the crafting grid gives you a feeling of possibility, just like the sort of mechanical intricacies of a science fiction setting. I'll save discussion for whether that's an effective way to design a game until later. For now, we can just agree that there are lots of pieces where we can cut content without breaking the core game. And that's exactly what I've done across the board. As the schedule has slipped, I've cut more and more content from the game. As I did, I expected implementation time to drop accordingly, but that never happened. I'm sure you can recall my frustration from earlier videos as I struggled to understand this problem. In the case of this project, I don't know, I guess game development is just different. I guess it's just different because I can't seem to make deadlines. I can't seem to set reasonable deadlines. I don't know what the problem is. The problem was that content was not the bottleneck. Feature complexity was the bottleneck, and I had badly misunderstood the relationship between the two. I mean, cutting content, it saved me time, but it didn't save me enough time to really matter in the grand scheme. Okay, let's take a clearer look at where I went wrong. Going into the project, I had expected to see roughly the same linear relationship between running length and production time when it came to a number of features and implementation time. I'd done enough development to expect a slight curve as complexity increased, but in truth, the relationship is not the same at all. It really looks more like this. A small number of features can quickly bump your implementation time up into the next decade. Now, this is easy to anticipate if you've got the bird's eye view of interactions in your head, but I had no experience with conceptual tools like this. And what's more, I had actually bamboozled myself into thinking that the relationship was linear during the prototyping phase. If you followed the campaign closely, you might remember several points where I resisted the push to release new add-ons as we got nearer to the end. Despite the ticking clock, I wanted to make sure I'd be able to actually implement these ideas before I committed to offering them. Now, you had no way of knowing this, but what I was actually doing was frantically prototyping these features to see if I was capable of creating them. And some were too complex, I decided. But on the whole, I was able to prototype things without trouble. The same thing applied to our serious business feature list. As we discussed features to add, whenever I saw one that seemed like it might be tricky, I'd attempt to prototype it really quickly. And when I ran into trouble immediately, I would rule it out. And I was pretty ruthless about thinning the herd, and I remember there was a lot of disappointment, but my goal was to avoid being boxed in by complexity. Unfortunately, prototyping was not an effective way to gauge complexity. This whole process was like a sped up version of my pre-Kickstarter prototyping experiences. I had a long list of everything I wanted to see in the game, and one by one I implemented each element in isolation, often within a matter of hours. Some prototypes were rougher than others, but I emerged from this process confident that with some polish, I'd have no trouble doing the real thing. Now, I don't mean to harp on prototyping. It's absolutely essential, and it did warn me off a couple of disasters. But it was a huge mistake to attempt to prototype everything in parallel, because it delayed my understanding of feature complexity until I was already in trouble. If I had set aside prototyping all the ambient elements until the core elements were roughly finished, I would have immediately grasped how complex the ambient elements would eventually become. I would have realized that far from creating this, I was actually creating this as I prototyped, which if you plot on a graph is going to look roughly like this. It takes a long time to finish an element, especially when it's interdependent. So the more features I added, the longer I delayed my realization of how badly I'd screwed myself. It's a little like painting yourself into a corner from 100 different directions, but so slowly that you don't actually see it happening. So yeah, I had a buffer of content to cut away as the schedule slipped, but if, say, missions by design require certain features and interactions, and I cut 9 out of 10 of my missions, I've actually saved almost no time at all. All the complexity that those interactions add to the rest of the game remain. So the only way I can actually save time is by redesigning missions to be less complex, or by cutting them entirely. But once I realize this, it's back on track, right? Just cut features instead of content. When is it ever that simple?